Welcome back to the Ed Show. Well, Florida Governor Rick Scott is back doing what he does best, leading the charge against voting rights. Here we go again. The governor won the 2010 general election by less than 62,000 votes. This was before voters learned who Rick Scott really was. Rick Scott is now running for re-election. It should come as no surprise Republicans in the state of Florida are already working to reduce access to the polls in 2014. On Tuesday, Manatee County's Republican-controlled Board of County Commissioners voted to eliminate almost 1/3 of the county's voting sites. Now, I refuse to believe that it's just a coincidence. The largest percentage of precinct closures will happen in the district of the board's only Democrat. Republicans say the move will save money. Last week, Florida Secretary of State Ken Detzner denied a request to use a college student union at the University of Florida as an early voting center. Detzner's office justified the decision by claiming that the building does not fit the list of eligible early voting sites. I refuse to believe that it's just a coincidence. That in 2012, President Barack Obama captured 66% of Florida's youth vote. Folks, things were already bad in Florida. Republicans have pushed for cuts to early voting days. Restrictions were put on voter registration drives. Voter polls were purged with the methods known to produce errors. During the 2012 election, the Orlando Sentinel estimated at least 201,000 voters did not cast ballots due to long lines. It's no coincidence the majority of those voters would have favored President Barack Obama over Mitt Romney. We cannot ignore Republican attempts to dismantle the democratic process. It is happening. This is happening in Republican-controlled legislatures across the country. In 2013, at least 92 restrictive voting bills were introduced in 33 states. Republican Governor Rick Scott in Florida is not protecting the integrity of the vote, and I think Rick Scott knows the only way he can ensure his re-election is by suppressing the vote. At least that's the way it appears to this broadcaster. Joining me now is former Florida Governor Charlie Crist, who is currently running again for governor in the state of Florida. Governor, good to have you with us tonight. You met with students yesterday at the University of Florida. What was your response on the ground there when they were told this wasn't going to be happening in 2014 on their turf?
They couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe that the governor, that Rick Scott and his administration would have the audacity to say that we're not going to allow you to vote on campus at the University of Florida. Obviously, a lot of young people, probably people who are more inclined to vote Democratic instead of Republican. But that's exactly what has happened. They're trying to suppress the vote. They're using every means possible to do that. And when you think about it, Ed, I mean, if you're on the team where if you have less people vote, that gives you a better chance to win, you're on the wrong team. I mean, it's unconscionable that anybody would try to thwart the ability of Americans to have the right to vote. People have died for that right, after all. And yet they would stand in the way of people exercising that precious right. It's unconscionable. It's hard to believe. It's happening, and it's wrong.
Governor Crist, what is your response to the number of voting sites that were shut down in one section of the state? And the reason given was that it was an economy move. It was going to save money. Your response to that?
Well, the right to vote is priceless. And the notion that you would have less places for people to be able to vote, especially in the example you cited in Manatee County, where the Democratic county commissioner, it's that district.
Yeah.
If that doesn't expose the fraud that's going on here, I don't know what does.
So you think Scott's behind all of this? You think he is engineering this?
I don't think there's any question about it. I mean, you know, he appointed the guy who's the Secretary of State who is carrying out these orders and telling people that they can't vote on the campus at the University of Florida, you know, and these kinds of things aren't new. The way I know that it's coming from Rick Scott is just look back to the 2012 election. Well, long lines. When we had him 4 years earlier, I signed an executive order to stop it. He wouldn't do it.
How can we come to the conclusion that it's going to be easier to vote in Florida in 2014 than it was in 2012?
I don't know that it is going to be easy. I think it's going to be challenging, and I think they're going to try to make it more difficult every single day. But I know this about my fellow Floridians. They will not be thwarted by exercise their right to vote. They didn't do it in 2012, and I think initially, Ed, they were frustrated.
Yeah.
Finally, I think they became infuriated. And, nothing was going to stop them to get to the vote. You'll remember the nice elderly lady that the president had at the State of the Union right after the election.
Yeah.
I think she was 94 years old, waited in line for hour after hour after hour. But she was determined to vote.
So how do you plan to fight these attacks on voting rights? How do you combat this?
Well, exactly what I'm doing right now, talk to you. And thank you for bringing light to it. Because if people don't know this is happening, then, they're going to go and try to be able to vote and end up having to wait in lines and not have the opportunity to actually vote. It's working people that they're really putting the hammer on because it's hard for them. They can't get off work. They have to go to work. And so if you have more early voting days, more early voting locations, it's more convenient for them to exercise this right.
So how have you put a calculation to how much this is going to help Scott's reelection chances?
Well, I don't think enough. I mean, I think the evidence is what happened to President Obama here in Florida in both 2008 and 12. As I said, in 2008, I signed an executive order that Dan Gelber asked me to do, expanding it so they had more opportunity to vote. In 2012, Governor Rick Scott would not do so. We were the last state to be able to have our votes counted in the presidential election. Thank goodness it was already over by then, but we didn't know that at the time. So shame on them for doing this. Shame on them for not helping their fellow Floridians have the right to vote and vote in a way that is convenient for them. The people are the boss. They ought to respond to them, not try to boss them around.
Well, it's pretty clear what they're up to in Florida. It is going to be harder to vote in 2014 than in 2012. Charlie Crist, great to have you with us tonight. I got to tell you, my wife and I were in a steakhouse here in New York the other day at Gallagher's. Your picture was on the wall, and Rick Scott's wasn't.
There you go.
You bet. There you go. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Coming up, Tennessee Senator Bob Corker drops a bombshell on the Volkswagen plant's union vote. He's taken his anti-union obstruction to a new level. Stay with us.